Welcome to Miller Chapel in the Anderson University School of Theology and Christian Ministry for our 42nd annual Newell Lecture Series. The Newell Lectures were begun from a gift and an effort and an initiative by Dr. Arlo Newell in honor of his wife Bonnie Newell, who studied biblical studies. Bonnie is here. Bonnie is here. In honor of his wife Helen Newell, who studied biblical studies here during his time as editor-in-chief at Warner Press. And Dr. Newell's and Helen's son Eric and his wife Bonnie are here, and they have brought a book that is available out in Talon Hall called That'll Preach, Timeless Sermons by Arlo Newell from the 1950s. And so she's going through, Bonnie's going through and putting these together by decades of his sermons. Today, our first lecture is Surviving Loss. And we have with us Dr. Ellen F. Davis, the Amos Reagan Kearns Distinguished Professor of Bible and Practical Theology at Duke Divinity School. Dr. Davis is literally one of my favorite Bible scholars, and I was so overjoyed that she accepted the invitation to come and give the 42nd annual Newell Lectures. I have a personal connection to Dr. Davis. We're going to have a Q&A later where we will talk about some of that at 2 o'clock. But I was able to sit as a TA in her classroom and work with seminary students after I had finished my MDiv there. And even before that, her presence within the seminary community was so large and so influential in the way that her work shaped the approach that students took, the embrace of agricultural metaphors of fruit and growing things. And so please welcome Dr. Ellen Davis for our first lecture.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to see how well Dean Willoughby has cleaned up. So, not that I remember him as being in great need of cleaning up, but it's a real pleasure to see you in this role now, Nathan. So, all right. Can everyone hear me well? All right. What I want to do today is dwell with you on two biblical women, Ruth and Naomi, whose story is familiar to us and has inspired both Jews and Christians through the millennia. I think it's accurate to say, although it surprises me, even though I've worked with this book quite a lot, but I think it's the case that Ruth and Naomi are the best known women in Scripture. Not even Mary of Nazareth gets 4 full chapters of character development. And with a few exceptions, these two are better known to us than any man in Scripture. Nonetheless, this is an unassuming little book, just 85 verses, and you have to scale down your expectations about biblical drama in order to discern God's presence and word in this book. As far as I know, Cecil B. DeMille found nothing worthy of note in the book of Ruth. So through the years, I've come to think of this as the still small voice of the Bible. No drama, or no big drama, just a story of a few ordinary people, and I'll be speaking more about that later today. My plan for these lectures is simple. I'm going to move slowly through this story, which is beautifully crafted, to see how it may speak to us in our own situations, living as we do some 3 millennia and half a world away from Iron Age Israel. But one prefatory question before we get into the story itself, something so basic that we almost never think to ask it, and that is this. Why would we think that reading a story with care can tell us anything about our life with God? This book hardly ever mentions God, and it isn't doing what most people in my university would call doing theology. And it may not be so different at this university. Academic theologians are trained to make arguments, historical arguments, philosophical arguments, philological arguments, whatever, and they have to have footnotes. But the biblical writers take a different approach. For them, and indeed for many people in traditional cultures, and when I say people in traditional cultures, I'm thinking of Jews, both modern and ancient, also African Christians, both groups with whom I have done a lot of work through the years. For all of them, telling stories is a serious way, no, it's an indispensable way of doing theology, just as it was, of course, for Jesus. A story, as you know, is a vehicle for probing what it is to be human, and probing that with what we would now call both sides of our brain, with our imagination as well as our powers of reason. And a biblical story encourages us to open our hearts, and lev, kardia, heart in Hebrew and Greek. That's the biblical word for what I think the best 21st century equivalent would be imagination. So the biblical story encourages us to open our heart to some aspect of the truth about our life with God. This is to say that I think you get further if you approach a biblical story less as a moral lesson, a la Aesop's fables, which are explicitly moral lessons, but if you think of it more as a playground for your holy imagination. And I think for this book in particular, playground is a good metaphor, because the book of Ruth is, as we know from our own experience, most of us, it's open and inviting to children. Although in fact, and I discover this more and more as my own life goes on, it's a book for every season of life, all of the different seasons that we in this room find ourselves in. Through the years, I've discovered that one of the most valuable things about this story is simply its ordinariness compared with other biblical books. No miracles, no divine appearances, no prophets or angelic visitors, not even a king or a battle. The characters here experience what we experience: grievous loss, unexpected gifts of kindness in the midst of that, eventually new life stirring out of the ashes. And what is more, the characters in this book experience God as we generally experience God. Through all of that, both the losses and the gifts, faintly discerning sort of behind it, underneath it, something of the hand of God. So in this lecture and the next, I intend to focus on two movements. With any luck at all, I'll figure out how to advance this. Maybe I'll turn it the other way. Getting there. Okay. So two movements that seem to me maybe most fundamental to the story. First, surviving devastating loss and learning, and then on the second, learning to take risks on the other side of loss. Wise risks, you might say, that prove to open up the long-term future. But now we begin with where the book itself begins, with the deaths of 3 men and the 3 widows who were left behind. And that in itself is worth pondering, because we tend to think that the pattern of life is birth to death. And most of the time in the Bible, that's the case. Moses, Jesus, we see them from their births to their deaths. But this story takes the opposite direction. It begins with death and ends with birth. So listen. This is my translation. As it happened in the days when the judges were judging, and I'll come back to that phrase in a minute. In the days when the judges were judging, there was a famine in the land. And a man went from Bethlehem means house of bread in Hebrew, in Judah, to sojourn in the fields of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. Moab is what we would now call the high plateau of Jordan. Now, the name of the man was Elimelech. It means my God is king. The name of his wife, Naomi means pleasantness. And the names of his 2 sons, Machlon, sickness, and Kilion, finish off. Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah. They came to Moab, and there they were. Then Elimelech died, Naomi's husband, and she was left, and her 2 sons. And they took for themselves wives, Moabites. The name of the one was Orpah, it means back of the neck, and the name of the second, Ruth, which doesn't mean anything in particular. And they settled there for about 10 years. Then the 2 of them also died, Machlon and Kilion, and the woman was left without her 2 boys and without her husband. So notice the style here. It's like a folk tale. The language is simple. When I teach first-year Hebrew, I very often use the book of Ruth. If some of you studied Hebrew through the book of first-year Hebrew, through the book of Ruth, it's got a sing-song rhythm to it. Almost everybody's name is, in this case the metaphor is intentional, a dead giveaway, okay? Machlon and Kilion, we know they're not going to make it very far into this story. So their names are transparent to the role that they play. It's like Little Red Riding Hood, okay? Even the place that's the focal point, Bethlehem, house of bread, the central issue here is there food or is there not food for the people in the land? As to content, a lot of territory is covered in these 5 verses. Famine, migration, you might say, using the more common Hebrew word, exile. No one voluntarily, or only the very rare person voluntarily left home. There's plenty of room in the front here. And I promise not to ask you any questions. So famine, migration or exile, marriage, widowhood, childlessness, all of that in 5 verses. For Naomi, the move is from, okay. For Naomi, the move is from here to here. Okay? This is, so I'm going to be showing you images. I think I'm mic'd so that you can hear me if I step away. Is that right? Okay. So I'm going to be showing you a lot of images from this book that I did with the artist Margaret Adams Parker a number of years ago now. And the genesis of the book was her 20 illustrations of her woodcuts of the book of Ruth. And then I wrote a commentary and did a translation to go with it. And each of these, each of her images has illustrates a line from the story. And the woman was left without her two boys and without her husband. Without her two boys. That's a telling phrase. Normally the Bible, and earlier in just a few verses earlier, we heard about Naomi's sons, her banim, but here the word yaladim is used. It's the word that you use for little boys. Okay, and to her, these Machlon and Kilion, these dead sons, they're still the yaladim that she bore and fed and cleaned up. Now they're gone. And as she will describe herself later, she is empty. So when she arrives in Bethlehem, and the women scarcely recognize her, they say, "Is this Naomi who left some 10 plus years ago?" Remember, her name means pleasantness, and she says, why, she says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, call me bitterness, because I went out full and empty, the Lord has brought me back. Why would you call me Naomi when the Lord has answered against me and Shaddai has done me evil?" Okay. I thought of this image within the last year when a friend of mine said something very similar 5 weeks after her husband's traumatic death. She said, "I am empty." An indigenous woman in Peru looked at the same image, and instantly she said, "She's hungry." Another form of emptiness. So, here are the women on the road back to Bethlehem, and I've given you a little map showing something of the journey that they would be taking through that wilderness. Again, the high plains of Jordan, then crossing the Jordan River and into and through the Judean wilderness and the Samaria. Okay. I'm just curious. This is one of my favorite images. In my study, I have all of these images, and this is one of my favorites. It's right by my desk. Any immediate responses to this image? Intense pain, okay? Anything else that strikes you? There's no particularly right answer to it. Yes? Hopelessness, okay? Other things that strike you about the way she's done it?
I see love and shelter.
Love and shelter? Okay, in the arms wrapped around each other? Okay. Anything else anyone wants to say?
Sharing compassion.
Sharing compassion. Okay. I'm sorry? Okay. Okay. Can one is alone or a little bit separate? Uh-huh. Can you tell who's who? They're all faceless. They're indistinguishable by their clothing, one from the other. It's interesting. Well, or maybe not. It's interesting. I've shown this image a couple of times recently, and people had very, very strong opinions about which one was Naomi and which one was Ruth. And they weren't all the same opinions. They weren't agreed on it. And then I showed this maybe a month ago. I was actually doing something with Peggy Parker, the artist. And I said, "Did you have a plan?" And she said, "No." You know, for her, she didn't have an intention for any one of them. But what is striking to me about it is I've actually seen them more as, you see one as being separate, Dean Willoughby. I've seen them more together, just delineated by those few white lines. I think woodcut is a very powerful medium for expressing this book. And for a long time, I thought of them as a monolith, you know, and I'm not sure that's a bad image. As you know, monolith, lithos means stone, and of course this is a very stony wilderness, and they look like a sort of pile of stones. But I showed this image once in Jerusalem, and in a time that was not so different from the time we're in tragically right now. And I remember a woman with tears in her eyes saying, "They're like a tree. They're like a tree that's been cut back to a stump, but something's going to grow from it." I told you that each of these images has an identifying phrase, and the phrase in Hebrew for this is "V'tisena et kolan." They lifted up their voice and they wept. And it's a singular, it's just Hebrew idiom, but you wouldn't say they lifted up their voices. It's a singular word. They lifted up their voice and they wept. It's they're weeping in unison. Then, just slightly beyond this in the story, we see Orpah. She's now turned the back of her neck. She's going back to her mother's house, just exactly as Naomi insisted that both these young women should do. Orpah is sometimes represented as the one who was lacking in the story. I don't think that's necessarily true. Naomi had said to them, "Go on, go back." It's fairly emphatic in Hebrew. "Each of you to her own mother's house, and may the Lord do covenant justice, covenant devotion." The Hebrew word is chesed. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. "May the Lord do covenant justice with you as you have done with the dead and with me." That word chesed is one of the key words in this book. It represents, you might say, both the horizontal dimension of covenant and the vertical dimension. So between human covenant partners, or arguably human and non-human, because the first covenant is in Genesis with all flesh, and also the vertical dimension of covenant between creatures, including human creatures, and God. But Ruth doesn't obey Naomi in this. She, you might say it's a kind of quiet defiance. maybe her first defiance of her mother-in-law, and this is what she says. Don't keep on at me about leaving you, about turning back from following after you, because wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you spend the night, I will spend the night. Your people, my people, your God, my God. Wherever you die, I shall die, and there I shall be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and even more. It's invoking a curse upon myself. If you could translate this one of two ways. If even death will make a separation between me and you, or you could render that only death will make a separation between me and you. You've likely heard these lines read at a wedding, and that actually makes good sense, even though in this case it's a different kind of relationship. But back in verse 14, we're told that Orpah, after this instruction to leave, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Ruth davkaba. Ruth cleaved to her. It's the same word that's used in Genesis. It's not used very often in the Bible, so sets up echoes in your mind. It's the word that's used in Genesis. A man shall leave father and mother and cleave to his wife. So there's kind of this is the way the Bible does footnotes, okay? There's an internal reference between the two passages. Okay. But Ruth's, you can see from the image here, Ruth's mode of cleaving is a confrontational one. Don't keep on at me about leaving you. It was interesting when Peggy Parker was working on this image, and initially she had a more comforting image with Ruth having her arm around Naomi. And I said, I don't think so. I think it's more like this, because the next line is, and when she, that's Naomi, saw how fixed she was on coming with her, she gave up talking to her. What are you going to do with her? Okay? And you see, this is, for Peggy Parker, this is Naomi's own classic posture of being set on something, okay? So what we're seeing in both the text and the image here is the emergence of a new kind of relationship between these two. There's a shifting power dynamic whereby the one who gave the orders is now receiving some pushback. And what we will see is that their relationship remains dynamic through the book, as I think is probably necessary for any healthy, intimate relationship that's going to have a future, that the power dynamic needs to be one that can shift. Okay. I draw your attention to this because what I want you to see is that this is a book of relationships. And rather unusually in the Bible, it's a book of human relationships in the first instance. Generally, the relational dynamic that's emphasized in biblical narrative is on what I've called the vertical plane between God and humanity, and that's quite right. But in this book, almost all the action turns on a couple of core human relations between Naomi and Ruth, between Ruth and Boaz. And the key to both of those is that quality that I've already mentioned that Naomi names. Chesed, covenant devotion. You'll hear that my translation of it keeps shifting because it's a word that doesn't have a single, it's only translated into English with significant loss, I would say. Loving kindness, steadfast love, those are the traditional renderings of it. I translate it in this book, good faith and acts of good faith, because it's both a disposition of the heart and the way that disposition of the heart works itself out in behavior. But however you conceive it, it's the glue that holds people together in covenant relationship, in committed relationship. Okay. I want to go back again to Naomi's words because there are a couple of weird things about them. First, this word chesed, go back, each of you, to her own mother's house, and may the Lord do chesed with you as you have done with the dead and with me. Normally, the Bible thinks of chesed as the quintessential Israelite virtue. I've just done a translation of the Psalms, and I translate chesed throughout there as covenant love. It's evoked continually between God and Israel. And it's generally assumed in the Bible that non-Israelites don't have that grace or demonstrate it in ample supply. Okay? But Naomi here, of course, is speaking to Moabites. Okay? And it's important to recall that in the larger story of the Bible, Moabites, and especially Moabite women, have a very poor reputation. I'm thinking of the story in Numbers 25 of the Moabite women who invite the Israelites over for dinner, and you know the Israelites wind up worshiping Baal Peor, in the language of Numbers, whoring after their gods, not to put too fine a point on it. So, Israelites are supposed to be giving Moabites a wide berth, not to get mixed up with them, certainly not to intermarry with them. But here, the Moabite widows, Ruth and Orpah, are held up as models of covenant devotion that even God would do well to emulate. Remember, Naomi is going to say shortly thereafter, God has done me wrong, done me evil. May God do chesed with you as you have done with the dead and with me. So that's the second weird thing, that humans, even women, even Moabite women, should teach God a thing or two about covenant devotion. The God who, according to God's self-revelation in Exodus, abounds in chesed and faithfulness. So this is a pretty subversive statement for an Israelite woman to make. Subversive from the perspective of a tendency to Israelite exclusivism as we see it sometimes in the Bible. And as you read on, I think the narrator is very conscious of this. Ruth's status as a foreigner is a big issue in this book. Repeatedly she is called Ruth the Moabite, waving that red flag. And let me see if I've got an image. Yeah, I do. Okay. Peggy Parker chose to make Ruth stand out by representing her with a tattoo. That's artist's license. It's not mentioned in the Bible, but Israelites were not supposed to mark their skin. And so that's one way that we don't know if Moabites marked their skin or not, but that was how she made Ruth stand out. So in this story, already the stereotype that attaches to Ruth's dodgy ethnicity, already that stereotype is being deconstructed through Naomi's wish or prayer for these women. And it's being deconstructed even more, and that's what this image represents, through Ruth's consistently demonstrated loyalty, her chesed. This is when they get to Bethlehem and she says, I've got to get out to the field and glean. We need food. So, chesed is the most important theological concept in this book, one of the most important in the Bible, as I've suggested. Here it's important because it becomes the mechanism of redemption. And let's think about that for a moment. Redemption in this story figures in the first instance as a legal issue. Who will exercise the privilege and the obligation within an Israelite family of redeeming, literally buying back, Elimelech's land that has been sold outside the family? But of course, redemption has a much broader semantic range, and in the Bible and in our theological vocabulary, and that too is applicable in this story. We tend to think of Ruth as a children's story, as a romance maybe, and it's certainly, there is an element of romance here, but more profoundly, this book is a tragedy redeemed. And that points to why, as I said, it functions as the still small voice in the Bible. Because the whole biblical story in both testaments of the Christian Bible, the whole thing is nothing other than a tragedy redeemed. A tragedy that begins in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, when in Eden humans begin to be alienated from God and from each other. And here we see that tragedy beginning to be redeemed, at least one of its beginnings, is through the selfless actions that one person renders to another. In this case, a young woman to her mother-in-law. Who knew? Ruth, leaving everything familiar behind to cross a potentially deadly wilderness and wind up in a town unknown to her, which will likely be hostile to foreigners in this kinship-based society. And she does it, we must surmise, because Ruth knows that if Naomi tries to make that journey alone, she won't get there. The book of Ruth does not violate the basic biblical and theological conviction that redemption ultimately comes from God. But the point for us to note now is that God acts mostly behind the scenes in this story, just as I've said, God does in our lives. Only 2 or 3 times do we see God acting directly, at the beginning and at the very end. At the beginning, when God breaks the famine and gives food to the Israelites, and that is then the occasion for Naomi coming home. But remember, she says, and this is God's second action, it's not a positive one, God brought me back empty. Okay? And then at the very end, we hear from the narrator that God gives Ruth pregnancy. Most of what comes between those two brackets of divine action is the story of human kindness and loyalty and courage, enacted by ordinary people, even quintessentially vulnerable people. Because Ruth, in her own person, Ruth embodies the three classic categories of the vulnerable. She's a widow, she's an orphan, which is to say she has no father to protect her in the story. That's what constitutes an orphan. And when she gets to Bethlehem, she's a sojourner. She's a stranger in a strange land. Okay? In the next lecture, I'll look more closely at how the interactions of these several vulnerable people open up a future that is consequential for every one of us, for Christians as well as Jews who recognize Ruth as mother of the Messiah, the great-grandmother of King David, founder of the House of David. And it's his name that appears as the very last word in this book, hinting at a future that will unfold from the small beginning in Bethlehem. Thank you. I don't have a clock, so I don't know how much time we have.
Yeah, at least 7 minutes.
Okay.
Probably 12. If there are any questions?
Comments?
Comments?
She said, do as you did with the dead and with me. What do you think those actions were that they did with the dead?
Okay. Well, of course, I have to speculate on that. I assume that it was being faithful partners and nursing them to their death. And we have no idea what brought about the deaths of these young men. And as you know, people in the ancient world didn't live to be very old, although in general, it was women who died very often before men if they died young, because they died in childbirth. So, of course, I don't know. But the fact that the women are still, Naomi refers to them consistently as her daughters. Which suggests, as you know, women came into in this book, one thing that's unusual is that the household, Naomi refers to it as go back to your mother's house. Okay, that's, in general, the technical term for the basic social unit was the Beit Av, the father's house. So this book is an exception. The Song of Songs would be the other exception in the Bible. But these women make themselves perhaps orphans in not going back to a parental home, but staying with their widowed mother-in-law. So I assume they were very loyal members of that household, and a household. They must have come and lived in Naomi's household because that was the practice of in that culture. So thank you. But as you point out, it's a suggestive phrase that points to something of the quality of those 10 years or however many years the marriage has actually lasted. Thoughts? Yes.
Speak a little bit more on just the portion where you talked about Naomi requesting of God to have Hesed like David had with her with them. I just find that really interesting. Like, what do you think the importance is of that there, and what would you?
Well, what I already said, so I'm going to have to ask you to say more, because what strikes me about it is that these women, unlikely characters as they are, being Moabites, are being held up to God in a prayer as a model for what God ought to be doing and evidently hasn't done yet. Okay? So as a kind, there's a kind of expression of disappointment. And, as you know, Israelites, we know it from the Psalms, are not afraid of telling God what God ought to be doing and hasn't done yet. Clearly, they were not proto-Episcopalians, as I am. Well, I am an Episcopalian. So I think it's a kind of veiled, it's both honoring the women and it's a veiled complaint, lament, so to speak. That's what I hear.
Yeah, I guess so. I took a class about a year ago that talked about Job and how Job speaks to God and how God responds. And this is a little reminiscent of that.
Uh-huh.
And I guess what comes to mind that I wonder if you could speak on a little bit is like we often, as Christians, are expected that we are kind of talk to God in a very kind of way and speak to Him.
As American Protestant Christians, let's add the appropriate adjectives. Okay. Okay.
And I don't know, just the way that I was taught some about how Job speaks to God, and maybe what's here is that maybe in a sense we have much more freedom to speak
Oh, okay.
to God and how we're feeling and those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, as you've said, it's indirect, and we don't have. This is as close as we have to a prayer in this book. And then the other thing that Naomi says about God is clearly expressing disappointment that God has done, Shaddai has done me wrong. Okay. So I think she's a good Israelite. She knows the book of Psalms, you might say. And so I would just say that I think American Christians are very buttoned up white American Christians. I keep adding more adjectives because I think that it's important to qualify these. One of the discoveries, but it's a rediscovery in my scholarly lifetime, beginning when I was in seminary, I'm thinking of Klaus Westermann publishing Praise and Lament in the Psalms, and that's late 70s, I think. It was translated into English, and it was one of the most important books. Walter Brueggemann was also in the late 70s beginning to publish his work on the Psalms, and both of them drew attention to the prominence of lament in the Bible. Job would be another place for that. Hugely important theological development. Thank you for coming. Okay.
All right, we'll take a break here for 10 minutes, 9 minutes, and I know some of you are going to your next class.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I was a pastor for about 5 years in a large suburban church. Made my way to do the reconciliation week in 2016.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Forever changed.
Oh, the Center for Reconciliation. summer of 2016? Okay. Okay.
Came back, resigned within 6 months, and dedicated my ministry, my life now to reconciliation, prison ministry, and
Oh,
intercession.
my.
So just a wonderful,
Oh, thank you.
hard transition.
You'd been a pastor here?
In about 8 miles away,
Uh-huh.
very white Protestant suburb.
Uh-huh.
So I was already a little bit different than most of the pastors that they had. I did have an eye for what I would call what they were missing. But when I came back, it was so interesting. I had a professor here that knew I was going, and she was actually a former dean here. She said, when you come back, go slowly. And I didn't know what that meant until